Hello, my name is Brant Hunt, and today is the 27th day of January 2023. And I wanted to tell you that I'm on Discerning What is True channel, and that channel is on Facebook with my name, Brant Hunt, also on Odyssey and on YouTube. This is a live broadcast. So, what I'm going to be sharing with you tonight is another chapter from Dr. John Coleman's work, Diplomacy by Deception. Dr. John Coleman is probably by the far the best writer on Tavistock, in my opinion, unless you deal with what I call the books that were written by the people who actually worked there, which actually Dr. John Coleman did work there himself. So, so let's continue tonight from this book called Diplomacy by Deception. This is chapter 7. And the title of the chapter is called Covert Operations. Covert operations, the stuff that James Bond was made of. As I have often said, James Bond was a fictitious character, but the organization portrayed in the movie series is very real. Only it is known as C and not M. Britain's Secret Intelligence Service and Security Service was what James Bond portrayed. They are known, these are known as MI5, internal security, and MI6 as external security. Together, they are the oldest of the world's secret intelligence agencies. They also lead the world in the development of techniques and new technologies of spying. Neither service is responsible to the British people through Parliament, and both operate in the utmost secrecy behind a wide variety of fronts. Remember, then he's written the book Committee of 300, and this is part with it also. I would suggest if you can get those books, I would get them, especially Committee of 300. Diplomacy by Deception. Also, I know that the Committee of 300 book is actually still available on Amazon if you're interested in that subject. But anyway, so they also lead in the world in development techniques and new technologies. Okay, we already said that. The beginning of these agencies date back to the time of Queen Elizabeth I, the founder being recognized as Sir Francis Walsingham, Walsingham, Elizabeth's Secretary of State, and have existed since then under different names. It is not the intention to write a history about these super secret espionage agencies, but merely to give a background to the main thrust of this chapter, which is covert action and assassinations for an economic or for political reasons. The cardinal thing to remember here is that in almost all cases, covert actions are forbidden by international law. Having said that, I should also point out that it's one thing to have laws against covert actions, but it is another very difficult thing to enforce such laws because of the extreme lengths which the parties will go to keep the operation secret. America is no exception when it comes to disobeying laws. President Gerald Ford, executive order banning engaging in or conspiring to engage in political assassination is largely ignored by the CIA. You see, you have a government above the government, you see, which is scary. And when one man tries to do what's right, they don't, they scoff at him and say, we'll do what we want to do. We're above you. And as far as I know now, I don't know if the CIA gets its own, does it get money from government funding? Yes, I'm sure it is, and it's secret, you see. The excuse that Bush didn't know what was going on in Iran-Contra covert operation cannot be sustained because of the Hughes Ryan amendment, which was tailor-made to knock the supports out from under such defense. The amendments were meant to make the CIA and other U.S. intelligence agencies accountable, until the president finds that each such operation is important to the national security of the United States and reports in a timely fashion to the appropriate committee of the Congress, including the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee. The covert operation would become unlawful. If either President Reagan or President Bush knew about the Iran-Contra operation, or if they did not, then those who engaged in it were acting in an illegal manner. In the Iran-Contra covert operation, Admiral John Poindexter was the fall guy for President Reagan and Bush, both of whom claimed to have no knowledge of it. This is shocking, though, because it implies that here are two presidents who had no control over their military intelligence departments. Had Poindexter not taken the stand to say that he never informed Bush about the specifics of the Iran-Contra operation, impeachment proceedings would have followed, which Bush, with all of his powerful protection, would not have been able to avoid. In this, Bush was ably assisted by Congressman Lee Hamilton, whose investigation of the covert action was so poorly carried out as to amount to a total whitewash of the guilty parties, including Reagan and Bush. Apart from James Bond, perhaps the best known MI6 operative were Sidney Riley, Bruce Lockhart, and Captain George Hill, who were seconded. Hold on a second here. Okay, sorry. We were seconded to Russia to help the Bolshevik overcome their enemies, at the same time secure vast raw materials and economic concessions for the British black nobility, with a slice of the pie going to the Wall Street financiers. Perhaps the least known MI6 agent, but one of the most effective, was Somerset Maugham, spelled Mauham, a distinguished British author well known in the literary world by this sheep-dipped name. Like most MI6 officers, Maugham's real name was not disclosed during his service years, and indeed remained undisclosed up until close to his death. Sidney Riley had 3 secret names, and 8 others. He had 11 passports, his real name being Sigmund Djorkaevich Rosenbaum. Setting aside all the diplomacy by deception of name tags such as Bolsheviks, socialism, Marxism, communism, Babyism, and Trotskyism, the fact is that Bolshevik revolution was a foreign ideology forced upon the Russian people by the Committee of 300 for economic gain and the control of Russia. And part of that gain was the Baku oil fields. Rockefeller wanted those. And I'm trying to remember, there's someone else who was fighting for those. I remember reading this in the past, that was what they were all about. And in fact, when Germany attacked going towards the east, one of their ways of attacking was to attack 3 areas, and one was Moscow, one was St. Petersburg, and the other was to the oil fields. But for some reason, Hitler decided to break off that seeking of the Baku oil fields, since it seemed like they were going to win the war, the battles, which they'd won already, part of it. They'd already impregnated so much of the land in Russia, the Soviet Union, that it seemed like it was invincible until they met Old Man Winter, and things changed dramatically then. But yes, they fought in Stalingrad, and they never got to the oil fields, folks. So the whole idea was that Rockefeller wanted those oil fields. And so it's always been about that. It always will be. It is that simple, and when stripped of all the rhetoric and terminology, makes the whole concept of communism easier to understand. We should never ever lose sight of the fact that, as Churchill put it, when he was irretrievably turned and lost, Russia was seized by the hair of his head and dragged kicking and screaming into the dictatorship straight out of hell, primary to exploit and control its vast resources, which even today far exceeds those of the United States, not to mention Great Britain, which, apart from coal and some North Sea oil, has nothing worth mentioning here that the Brits have. Just as the days of Queen Elizabeth I, when the Cecils, her controllers, set up Sir Francis Walsingham as a spy system to guard her assets in England and to watch over trade in the far corners of the world, so did the modern kings and queens of England carry on the tradition. One might say that these spy organizations were motivated first by economics and then by national sovereignty. Nothing much has changed in the intervening centuries. That was what Sidney Riley knew. That's what Sidney Riley's now legendary mission to Russia was about. It was to secure a lock on Russia's oil and its other huge treasures of minerals for the British black nobility, led by Lord Alfred Milner, the City of London's merchant bankers, and the American Boston Brahmins, Wall Street financiers, and tycoons, among the better known of whom are the Rockefellers, J.P. Morgan, and Kuhn Loeb. Sharing Britain's plunder gained through diplomacy by deception and backed by military might become a tradition during the golden era of the vast, unbelievable, lucrative opium trade with China. The oldest American equivalent of noble families were up to their eyebrows in the unspeakable trade. Today, one would never know this as they are judged on their outward facade of attending the best schools and colleges, joining the finest private clubs, becoming leading lawyers and bankers, philanthropists, religious leaders, and of course, leading politicians. That this brute is smeared all over with, that this brute is smeared all over with, and mired in the stench and filth of the China opium trade, which brought death and misery to millions while filling the banks they own with obscenely vast wealth. The Rhodes Gallery, let me explain one thing here, folks. I've found out some knowledge I think it's important for you to understand. If you are smoking cigarettes, are you aware why you struggle to stop smoking? Well, part of it might be simply is that opium is used in the cigarette trade. That's right. Opium is used on the paper and where the tobacco is inside. Not only that, many chemicals are put in that way to keep you also. But there is opium that is actually used in cigarette paper. So this is why people struggle to quote unquote stop smoking in their lives. They do. They can't stop, it seems. The Rhodes Gallery of the China opium trade reads like a page out of the American Social Register. That is John Perkins, Thomas Nelson Perkins, Delaney, Cabot, Lodge, Russell, Morgan, Mellon. Hardly a single one of our elite families is not tainted by opium riches. Lord Alfred Milner sent Sidney Riley of MI6 to secure the Baku region oil fields for British investment and for Rockefeller. Bruce Lockhart was Lord Milner's personal representative who controlled Lenin and Trotsky. So Lenin and Trotsky, we think these guys are doing what they want to do, when reality is that they both are like dogs and they have a leash on them. And so they don't do anything unless it's approved. Hansard of the time, which is the equivalent of our congressional record, is filled with expressions of outrage and frustration that Parliament began to glean a little information about the exploits of Riley. There were furious exchanges in private between Prime Minister Lord George, that is Earl of Twyford, and his cabinet colleagues, and in open debate with members of Parliament on the floor of the House. All demanded that Riley be brought back and forced to give account of his doings in Russia. But to no avail, Riley remained untouchable, unaccountable, or perhaps the very first time the British public became dimly aware that some unseen force was above Parliament, the British public did not know and could not know that Riley represented MI6, which had a much greater power than that of their elected representatives in Parliament. Those who were trying to break down the wall of secrecy got nowhere. So they waited for Riley's return to England, which came only after it was all over. Riley and his close friend, Count Felix Dzerzhinsky, they both came from the same part of Poland, that is, head of the dreaded Bolshevik secret police terror apparel, staged Riley's death by shooting as he was allegedly trying to escape across the border. The cover story was that Riley's name was discovered among the papers of a group of Latvian officers who planned to assassinate Lenin. That is, Riley lived in secret opulsion and splendor in Soviet Russia until to round out the plan, he escaped aboard a Dutch freighter. Riley was recruited by Sir William Wiseman, head of British MI6 in Washington. In 1917, Riley was described by his superiors, that is, Sir Mansfield Smith Cummings, as a sinister man I felt I could never really trust. So Somerset Maugham, mission to Petrograd on behalf of MI6 in 1917, was a classic example of diplomacy by deception. Lockhart was the special telegraph to back the provision of Alexander Kerensky. Remember now, um, what is taking place here in Russia, as once the Tsar has been replaced, they're looking for someone who comes in and kind of basically gets things kind of settled back down. And Alexander Kerensky was that man. He was not a Bolshevik. He was a Menshevik. So he was not what we call a hardliner. So, so if you study Soviet history, especially the Bolshevik Revolution, he is he's basically the he's the interim government that basically had basically stopped the Bolsheviks at that time, and people kind of got rest assured that things were getting back to normal, but that wasn't the case, folks. De Klerk, the South African turncoat leader, had quite properly been discredited as the Kerensky of the whites in South Africa because his task is to form an interim government which will allow Mandela and his gang of murderers to take the country. So this is what happened. Kerensky was the same kind of guy that is taking place in South Africa after de Klerk, not after de Klerk, but P.W. Botha was ousted, was no longer the leader, and they began to the whole thing of South Africa changed gradually. But de Klerk was the one who really basically was the one that failed. He was bought off. Anyway, what neither the British Parliament nor the public knew was that the government of Kerensky was programmed to fail. Its job to make it look as if the real opposition to a Bolshevik government was coming from Britain and the United States, when in fact the opposite was true. An elaborate stage managerial plot. Moltmann, who was also selected by Sir William Wiseman, went to meet Kerensky, traveling via Japan with $150,000. Yes, it was mainly American money to spend on Kerensky. Moltmann left on June 17, 1917, and met with Kerensky on October 31st, 1917. Kerensky asked Moltmann to deliver a note to Prime Minister Lloyd George, which contained a desperate appeal for guns and ammunition. It's interesting that Kerensky completely bypassed the British consul in Petrograd, having sniffed out that something was going on behind his back. Fired off anger complaints to Lord George, but got no apology or explanation. As Captain Hill himself once said, those who believe that the Bolshevik Revolution was a Zionist-inspired run may have had some truth on their side. Wiseman, Moltmann, and Hill and Raleigh were all Jews, but Lockhart was a pure Anglo-Saxon. The British Prime Minister response to Kerensky's note was a very brusque, I cannot do that. Moltmann never went back to Russia, and Kerensky was overthrown by the Bolsheviks on November 7, 1917. So when Kerensky got to Met in October 1917, it was actually 8 days later that the communist Bolsheviks got in power. Captain Hill was drafted into the MI5 and then the MI6. He was sent to Petrograd to advise Trotsky on how to set up an air force, although Russia was still technically an ally of the British. The objections in this diplomacy by deception maneuvering was to ensure that Russia remained at war against Germany, which Britain wanted defeated because of its great commercial and financial structures. You see the success. At the same time, Russia was to be weakened to such an extent that it would not be able to resist the Bolsheviks' horrors for long. As we know, deception worked perfectly. Captain Hill played a big role in helping to set up the Cheka, CHEKA, the dreaded Bolshevik secret police, apparel, and military intelligence, forerunner of the GRU. One of Hill's exploits was the transference of the crown jewels of Romania. Hill, a weapons and training specialist, was very active in diplomacy by deception and aided the grand design to make the world believe that Britain and the United States were really fighting the Bolshevik takeover. That's right. Only France of all the nations was not deceived. In documents I read years later, Allen Dulles, head of the OSS, was denounced by de Gaulle, who bluntly reminded him of the great diplomacy by deception successful pulled off against Tsar Nicholas II and the Russian people. An intricate part of the deception was to land a combined British, French, and American forces at Murmansk on June 23, 1918. under the command of Major General Frederick Poole, Poole, ostensibly to help the Russians in their struggle against the Bolsheviks. The French truly believed that they were there to attack the Bolsheviks. When the Allies' force moved into Archangel on August 2nd, in which there was some fighting, actually, the expeditionary force had three objectives here: to make it look as if Britain and America were battling the Bolsheviks; two, to protect the large cache of Russian army weapons and munitions in the region; and C, to help convert a doubtful populace to support Lenin by making it look as if he was the savior of the motherland, struggling to repel a foreign military force. But you have to also understand here, the American British forces that went, and even French went, were basically a token force, folks. There was nothing of seriousness there. It was just read this, you can read this information, folks. It's online. In reality, the British American forces were actually there to help Lenin and not fight the Red Army. The Allied troops were to see that the munition dump was turned over to the Bolsheviks and to prevent it being taken over by the advancing Germans. Years later, Secretary of State George Marshall repeated the trick against China's Marshal Chiang Kai-shek, leaving a large arsenal for Mao Tse-tung to use the struggle to turn China into a communist nation. Are you aware, folks, that Mao Tse-tung came to America? Are you aware he came here? He came to Harvard or Yale in the early 1900s. I'm guessing the 1917s or 1920s. And eventually he was used to overthrow the legitimate government of China, Chiang Kai-shek. And they left a huge arsenal for Mao Tse-tung to use in the struggle to turn China into a communist nation. That's right. Our country set up these things, folks. Our country did this. And it had to be. You see. The third objective was to convert those Russians wavering in the support of Lenin into full-blown supporters. Lenin used the Murmansk landing to tell the Russian people, look, British and American imperialists are trying to steal Russia from you. You see, join us in our struggle to defeat Mother Russia. And as this happens, and then eventually when white Russian generals Deneke and Wrangel were having sweeping success against the Red Army, pushing it out of the Baku region and threatening the work done by Sidney Riley for British and American oil industry, especially Rockefeller's oil industry, the same Lord George, who in 1970 plotted for Comanche, was joined by a private American citizen, William Bullock, that is actually emissary for Rockefeller and the Wall Street bankers. Together, they committed treachery against their respective countries. In January 1919, General Peter Deneke defeated the Bolsheviks in Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Turkestan. These are all oil regions, folks. And later that month, drove the Bolsheviks right out of the Caucasus, advancing almost to the gates of Moscow. Thereupon, Bullock and Lord George pulled the rug out from under the White Russians. They cut off their supplies of arms and ammunition and money. You're going too far, my friend. You can't do this. See, it's a ploy. Now, I don't know if General Peter Deneke realized this, but he was set up. Upon a signal from Lord George sent through MI6 in September, the American-British forces abandoned Archangel and sailed for Murmansk on October 12, 1919. So they were only there, let's see they were there from June 23rd, 1918, and they left October 12th, 1919. So they wasn't even there for 6 months, folks. What a joke. Please note the perfect timing of the operation. The only thing the expeditionary forces had done, apart from slight fighting Archangel and some other skirmishes against Bolshevik forces, was march through the streets of Vladivostok in support, that is in the Pacific Ocean seaport, in support of Lenin's contention that here were British and American imperial soldiers bent on taking over Mother Russia. By November 14, 1920, it was all over as the last white Russian forces embarked for Constantinople. One of the greatest pieces of diplomacy by deception had been successfully pulled off without the American and British people having the slightest notion of what was going on. A more or less similar procedure is being carried out in Russia today, with ex-communist Boris Yeltsin being touted by the West as some sort of Russian folk hero trying to save Russia from a revival of communism, as it was in 1917. So it is now. The American public has no inkling of what is really transpiring in Russia. There's much more to the plot. The attempted assassination of Lenin when he began kicking over the traces controlled by Bruce Lockhart, Lockhart's arrest and later exchange for Bolshevik Maxim Litvinov, completed with a sentence of death and absentee handed down by a Bolshevik court in Moscow. In this manner, MI6 plays this game in the most mastery of fashions, even as it still does today. Incidentally, Lenin did die of syphilis of the brain, and not from wounds received at the hands of Dora Kaplan. It might be in order to explain also or expand upon the doings of Captain Hill. Documents I was able to examine in the archives of Whitehall, London, tells a great deal about the activities of Hill, a second-generation MI5 officer. Hill's father was apparently very active in Jewish merchant circles with connections to Salonia in the time of Tsar Nicholas II. Hill's son, that is George, who lived in London, was an MI5 courier for Wall Street and the City of London financially backing the Bolsheviks. The money was channeled through Maxim Gorky. That's right, Maxim Gorky, the darling of the theater set in London. In 1916, he was promoted to MI6 and sent to Salonika by MI6 chief Sir Mansfield Cummings. From Salonika, Hill reported intelligent information to Cummings on the progress of the Bolshevik plotting for the coming revolution, almost 10 years in the making. On November 17, 1917, Cummings ordered Hill to Moscow, where he had once become a personal aide to Leon Trotsky on the recommendations of Parvius, that is Anders Helplin. Hill drew up a plan for military intelligence, was accepted, and became the basis of the GRU, with Hill and Trotsky as its founders. The Cheka remained under the control of Dzerzhinsky in later years, according to Whitehall documents, following a request from Jerusalem. Hill was sent to the Middle East, where he set about organizing and training the Jewish Irgun and STEM gangs, with the vast majority of officers in rank and file came from Bolshevik Russia. The intelligence service of Hill, set up for the Irgun, was later adopted by the Israel Secret Service, which became known as the Mossad. The British Secret Intelligence Service is the most expert at covert operations. Sir Stuart Mizison, MI6 wartime chief, once described Allen Dulles as lacking the necessity equipment to really understand covert operations. Be that as it may, MI6 formed and trained the OSS, which is the forerunner of the CIA. Covert operations may be described as perhaps the most sensational part of intelligence work, which generally speaking includes fairly routine activities like monitoring economic activities all over the world, prepare reports which go to national policymakers who are at allegedly that part of government which decides what courses of action should be taken. MI6 and the CIA are by law not allowed to meddle in domestic affairs or spy on their citizens, yet their duties confined to foreign matters. But in the past 3 years, these lines have become very blurred, which ought to be cause for serious concern. But unfortunately, no positive action is being taken to curb the phenomenon. Covert action walks a tightrope between diplomacy and deception, and sometimes when the walker slips, the results can be very embarrassing if the covert action is not deniable, as was the case with the Iran-Contra affair. Covert action calls for an intelligence agency to draw up a program to achieve a particular foreign objective. This often impinges on foreign policy, which is outside the realm of intelligence. A good case in point is the paranoia expressed by President George Bush, his desire to literally destroy Iraq's President Hussein. Covert action taking both economic and military avenues. A total of $40 million was wasted by Bush in his failed endeavor to kill Hussein, in which every trick was tried, including sending HIV virus and vials to be secretly into his headquarters, the Revolutionary Command. In the end, Bush, overcome by his hatred of Hussein, unleashed 40 cruise missiles against Baghdad and Basra under the flimsy pretext of attacking nuclear arm plants, and anti-aircraft sites, both patently, both patiently, both patently absurd. One cruise missile was deliberately programmed to hit the Al Rasheen Hotel in downtown Baghdad, where a conference of the heads of Muslim states was in progress. The idea behind the Al Rasheen attack: the missile was tracked by Russia's satellites from the moment of launching until it hit the target area, was to kill several of the Muslim leaders, thereby turning their countries against Iraq and helping through a backlash against President Hassan to topple the Iraqi leader. Unfortunately for Bush, the missiles fell 20 to 30 feet short of the actual building, shattering doors and windows up to 3 stories, killing a female receptionist. None of the Muslim delegates were hurt. The feeble and childish excuse made by the Pentagon and the White House that the missile was knocked off course by Iraqi anti-aircraft gunners was so absurd that the GGSE, that is the French intelligence, was highly skeptical about whether the report was genuine or the work of some crackpot privacy agency. The Russian military, securing the data provided by the Allies, told the U.S. government an explanation was false and that they had the evidence to prove it at $1 million per missile. Bush paranoid behavior cost the American taxpayers $40 million on top of the COVID price tag of $40 million. And apparent that some mechanism is urgently needed to curb future presidents who in their last days in office might seek to follow the shocking example set by Bush. Covert actions can often be taken by a government against its own people. Take the case of Alger Hiss and Rockefeller. As the Petroleum said, they own no special obligation to America. This is true in the context of arrangements made with Bolsheviks by David Rockefeller and British oil companies. The United States ended up promoting socialism and communists to reward the Bolsheviks for oil concessions given to Rockefeller and Armour Hammer. Certainly that proved their contention that the petroleum industry was not necessarily loyal to the U.S. In 1936, Alger Hiss was invited by Francis B. Sayre, Woodrow Wilson's son-in-law, to enter the State Department. The RIIA and the CFR decided Hiss was a good man who would do what he was told, regardless of whether he was good for America or not actually. Hiss was Rockefeller's first choice, not Sayre's, but Rockefeller stayed in the shadows at this point. In 1936, when Sayre made his approach, Hiss was already deeply involved in espionage for the USSR, and the fact was well known to his law professor at Harvard. When Hiss was promoted to the position of assistant supervisor of political relations to the State Department, Chambers and his man named the man Chambers went to will be allergic with. And a man named Levi blew Hiss's cover, reporting that he was active in working for the Soviet Union. The man Chambers went to with the allegation was Marvin McIntyre, who failed to give the information to Roosevelt, who was his boss. Instead, he sidetracked Chambers to Adolph A. Burl, who at the time was Assistant Secretary of State in charge of State Department security. Burl went to Roosevelt with the story, only to be abruptly dismissed by the president. Undaunted, Burl took his information to Dean Acheson, but exactly nothing happened to Hiss. He was not called on for an explanation. Instead, he was promoted by Roosevelt, a Rockefeller CFR puppet, as Roosevelt's entire staff was. In 1944, this is still Alger Hiss, received another boost with a promotion to the post of Special Assistant to the Director of Foreign Eastern Affairs, where he was well placed to serve the Soviet expansion plans in Asia. To demonstrate the inerrancy of the Rockefellers, all the time Hiss was a rising star at State, the FBI had on file of him. He was denounced by the Soviet defector Igor Gorzinski, who worked in the office of the GRU, that is the Soviet military intelligence, in Ottawa, Canada. The State Department heads knew all about Hiss and his Soviet connections, as did President Roosevelt, but made no move to get rid of him. While Rockefeller was planning the United Nations, he and Stalin agreed on a deal in which the UN would not interfere in Russian affairs in exchange for Soviet oil for the Rockefeller oil companies. See, folks, it's all about money. Money, it's all about that. Nor would the Bolsheviks meddle in Saudi Arabia and make no further attempts to get into Iran. The man nominated to represent Rockefeller at the UN was Alger Hiss. His immediate superior was Nelson Rockefeller, who gave orders to John Forrest Dulles. Roosevelt, Dulles, the FBI, and the Rockefeller all knew that Hiss was working with the Soviet Union. Following the modem of Standard Oil, the mechanism for controlling the United Nations was taken out of American hands. The Secretary General was given the power to appoint whomever he pleased for his treason. Hiss received a special staff appointment to Carnegie Endowment Fund for International Peace at a salary of $20,000 per year. A very good income for those days, that is. The idea was to place Hiss above the law. In fact, Hiss was above the law because he got away with treason and treachery. Hiss was not charged with treason, but with perjury, however. Powerful people immediately rushed to his defense. Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter gave Hiss a clean bill of health, and Rockefeller paid his legal expenses at the tune of $100,000. At the time he was confronted by Chambers, Hiss was working as a member of the Executive Committee for the Association of the United Nations, Chief Executive for the Institute of Pacific Relations, and was a leading member of the CFR, as well as president of the Carnegie Foundation. The House of Hiss was built on petroleum industry, that is, and never was there such a recorded case of abuse of power by the petroleum industry then as with Hiss. Petroleum industry showed no fear of the government when Hiss was brought before the court. Indeed, the petroleum industry almost pulled their man out of harm's way and would have done so had Hiss not tripped himself up. The Hiss case is a good example of diplomacy by deception by government against its own people. In Iran, the United States is currently engaged in covert action against the government using local groups inside the country and working with others in exile. The United States has become alarmed at the increasing arms buildup by the Iranian government and has placed a special watch on arms shipments destined for the country. In addition, there remains a large reservoir of ill will between the two countries over the activities of Hezbollah and Iran's willingness to give sanctuary to groups regarded as hostile to Israel. Therefore, a danger to stability of the Middle East has arisen. Iran is becoming increasingly hostile towards the U.S. and its Middle Eastern allies, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Israel. That there is trouble brewing for those countries is a foregone conclusion, which may be why Israeli intelligence is claiming that Iran will be a nuclear power at a much earlier date than was predicted by CIA. The Iranians, for their part, say that it's just another ploy by Israel to get what calls its big brother to attack us like they did with Hussein. The Iranian government now has a network of agents all across Western Europe and is particularly strong in Germany. These agents also active in Saudi Arabia, where the royal family is regarded with the utmost contempt by Tehran. The Iranian government is the principal financial and logistic backers of 10 that is, Islamic fundamentalist camps in Sudan, which Egypt's President Hosni Mubarak complained to the United States State Department in December of 1992. The complaint has not been made public, though. The training camp is in Sudan and are as follows. I'm not going to go into this part. There are many different groups that are involved here being trained in Sudan. Let's skip over that. The camps are coordinated in the office of the Arab Popular Islamic Congress, very close to the Egyptian embassy in Cairo. It is a very modern facility with the latest communication equipment that allows the Congress to be in contact with leaders of the Islamic fundamentalist movement in other lands. It is known as GCHQ. Its monitoring communications of the important office from Cyprus among their communications to the Mufti of the Egyptian Jihad, Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman. Rahman was found not guilty of conspiring to murder the late President Anwar Sadat of Egypt, and on his release moved to the United States, where he coordinates fundamentalist activities from a storefront mosque in New Jersey. Sheikh Rahman is said to have funded several hundred Arabs who were forced out of Pakistan by the United States, which in both overt and covert activities pressured the Palestinian government to crack down on Islamic fundamentalism in their country. Covert action against Pakistan took many forms, but bribery was the key element. Using the techniques taught to the late Ayatollah Khomeini by MI6, the Iranian government has adopted the techniques to suit Hamas, which are proved very effectively, accustomed to being able to penetrate the PLO without very much difficulty. Israeli intelligence found it was up against something different with Hamas. The case of Israeli border guard, such and such endpoint, it turned out, was murdered on December 14, 1992, and the Shin Bet. Israel's internal security agency still has no clues as to who was responsible. Anyway, I'm going to go through this. We're going to get down to what I feel like the meat is here. Iran stepped up active phase of opposition to what the Tehran government perceives as United's pro-Israeli policies when the agreement reached at this time of the hostile crisis was allegedly broken by Washington. Using Hezbollah in covert actions against the United States was to pressure public opinion in America and make it turn against Israel. Here Iran used the Tavistock of human relations methodology handed down to those who overthrew the Shah of Iran. Tavistock's founder and brilliant technician, John Rawlins Rees, which I've shared with you, then adapted the Operation Research military management techniques so that they could be applied to controlling a society from an individual unit right through to millions of such units, i.e., that is, people and the society and nations that collectively make up. In order to accomplish this successfully, rapid data processing was necessary, and it came within the development of linear programming in 1946 following its invention by George B. Danzy. Significant in 1946 was the year that Tavistock declared war on the American nation. This set the stage for total people control. Again, we go back to the Tehran government of Ayatollah Khomeini permitted the establishment of a covert action organization as Hezbollah. Later, using Hezbollah, a number of American and other foreign nationals were kidnapped in Beirut and other areas in the Middle East and held in secret location. The five-man cell system worked to perfection. Neither MI6 nor the CIA were able to break Hezbollah codes and the hostage language for years until the United States was forced to admit defeat and enter into negotiation with Hezbollah. An agreement was reached which said that shortly after the release of the last hostage held by Hezbollah, the United States would unfreeze Iranian bank accounts and financial instruments amounting to an estimated $12 billion. The United States would also release military equipment ordered and paid for by the Shah that he had not delivered, believed to be worth $300 million. In addition, Iran would be allowed to join the Gulf Cooperation Council so that it could join in deliberations by Israel. In addition, the U.S. undertook not to engage in covert activities against Iran inside its national boundaries, nor seek to punish Hezbollah kidnappers who were given sanctuary in Tehran. However, Tehran said that Washington acted in bad faith, keeping not a single one of its promises. The bank accounts were not unfrozen. The military equipment paid for by the Shah was not returned to Iran. The CIA actually stepped up covert activities inside the country, and Iran still remained frozen out of the Gulf Cooperative Council. Tehran points in anger to increased terrorist attacks in Tehran, attacks which began in 1992 after the last hostage was handed over. The commander of the Pastorales accused the CIA of building a network of royalties around Mossad Mojavdi, leader of the Mojahideens, and Pegah Cardin, and masterminding attacks on Passadera barracks, public buildings, and including a library, and attacks on the funeral cortege of the late Hashim Rasafajaria, and the discretion of the Tau tomb of Ayatollah Khomeini. These attacks have not been reported by the U.S. news media. Officially, the diplomatic relationships between the U.S. and Iran are described as being good. The CIA and MI6 have second go-around with Iran when the Shah began to dig his heels in against barefoot robbery by Americans and British oil companies with concessions in Iran. The petroleum companies that entered in a conspiracy with President Carter and a carbon copy of the Mossadegh operation was launched. 60 CIA and 10 MI6 agents were dispatched to Tehran to undermine the Shah and bring about his downfall and subsequently his murder. Covert actions does not always mean intelligent operations and terrorist groups with support of their governments. It can and does take the form of technological cooperation, especially in the areas of surveillance and monitoring of communications, because they are unspeculated. As a rule, this type of snooping does not arouse a lot of interest, but is one of the clearest examples of diplomacy by deception. Two of the biggest and more comprehensive listing posts in the world are located in England and in Cuba. The government communications headquarters in Cheltenham, England, is probably one of the worst offenders when it comes to snooping. Although the U.S. Constitution forbids snooping on its citizens, the National Security Agency meshes tightly with the GCHQ and deceives the people of both nations in their ongoing overall surveillance operations. The U.S. Congress is either unaware of what is going on or unthinkable, that is, or else very possible to intimidate to put a stop to such illegal actions which occur every day at NSA. The Committee of 300 controls these organizations and is a powerful, unseen force behind the decision to make Britain and Swiss mobile cell phones of the next 256-byte algorithm generation comply with snooping requirements of the British and American security services. It's almost certain that only the ASX5 version with a 56-byte easier to listen to on a phone will be allowed. This is one of the methods used by the government to secretly control their people. The latest technology, that is, to give all public call phones a special number. In certain countries in Europe, that is, the pay phones ends with 98 or 99. This allows a quick fix on the location to pay phones, which then are used for secure conversations. Only calling from a pay phone is no longer secure, that is. In genuine cases such as where a crime is in progress or kidnappers call to demand ransom money, this is indeed a very useful tool. But what happens to the privacy of the individual in case where no crime is involved? Do innocent citizens get their phone conversations snooped on? The answer is very definitely a yes. So we're going to continue. We're going to conclude this at this moment, and I thank you for listening. I just want to share with you again what the Dr. John Coleman's book here, Deception by Diplomacy by Deception here. And I wish you a good night, and you take care.